From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wichman. U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue was in and around Manhattan yesterday, conducting several public discussion forums and touring ag-related facilities at Kansas State University. He was joined by Senators Pat Roberts and Jerry Moran. The Farm Bill and trade were the primary focuses of those public forums. In just a moment, we'll hear thoughts from all three. Also, more today from last week's cover crop field day near Hayes. K-State beef specialist Sandy Johnson discusses options for grazing cover crops. And in this week's horticulture piece, Johnson County Extension horticulture agent Dennis Patton covers two concerns that he's seeing: winter overkill and herbicide injury. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.
When a thunderstorm approaches, follow these safety tips. Lightning, known as the underrated killer, usually strikes the tallest objects, so avoid standing beneath trees or other isolated tall objects. Take shelter in a sturdy building. Remember, if you're close enough to hear thunder, you're close enough to be struck by lightning. Help keep you and your family safe this severe weather season. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wichman. U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue and Senators Pat Roberts and Jerry Moran participated in an agricultural discussion panel yesterday at River Creek Farms near Manhattan. As you might guess, the Farm Bill and trade were heavily discussed. Senator Roberts is optimistic that there will be action on the Farm Bill in early to mid-June.
There's no question that the House bill, as it is, I cannot introduce that bill and have it pass even the Senate Ag Committee. Well, we would pass it on 11-10 vote, maybe, and then it gets to the floor, and what we're talking about is the SNAP program and who's able-bodied and what kind of a program we can put together to move people from dependence to independence. It was quite a, I'm not sure if it's historic, but the Speaker of the House said we're going to do welfare reform in the Farm Bill. You know, I don't know how many times people have asked me, why don't we just put the SNAP program over there with the Department of H2S and leave it over there and just do the Farm Bill? We would not have the most passed Farm Bill in the Senate without a SNAP program. That's just the way it is. And it's been that way ever since I've had the privilege of representing you in the House or the Senate. That is the key issue for many, many Democrats. So for me to get a Farm Bill with 60 votes, the House bill does pose some challenges, but you can always address those in the conference. The key is to get a bill. The key is to get a bill that addresses the certainty, again, and the predictability. There isn't any commodity group here that's going to be hurt by the Senate bill. We might not get as much rural development money as we would like to have, but we are funding rural development at an increased level. And we're trying to do that with conservation. And I'll just say that we're going to do our very best to get a bill. We are going to fix the ARC program to some degree, not maybe as much as some people want. I might add that it's necessary that we don't have one section of farm country trying to advise us to do something at the expense of another section. So what I'm telling you is we can make some changes in the food stamp program, or especially the bonus program, which is fraught with abuse. A lot of states just gamed that system. Not Kansas, Governor. We were clean, but the others were not. There's some efficiencies we can make on how that program is administered. Just get it across the floor, then we got a bill, then we go to conference, and then we get down to arm wrestling. And let me say this. I know many farm organizations, many commodity groups, and everybody involved in agriculture has a piece of this bill. But the big issue is not so much what each organization wants or each commodity organization wants. We've tried to address that to the very best that we can with the help of the Secretary, all of us working on the trade issue, more especially the Secretary. This issue is certainty and predictability. We're in a rough patch. this is a bad time. We're in the 5th year in a row of low farm prices. Farm income has dropped 52%. Who else in the economy has gone through that? And still head high, get out there and do what we do to follow the Kansas motto, to the stars through difficulties. Given that situation, I know these other issues are very important, and I'm going to listen to them, and we're going to do this in a bipartisan way. I have to. I should be doing that in order to get 60 votes. We will get the 60 votes. We will put this farm bill together. There's going to be some folks who aren't going to like it because it isn't exactly what they would like to have during this time of trouble. I know that. But the biggest issue, again, is certainty and predictability for farmers so they can continue. And their bankers and their lenders and everybody involved up and down Main Street involved in agriculture. So June 6th, and I hope the next week we put it on the floor.
When it comes to agricultural trade, Senator Moran says the U.S. has competition from around the world, and we need to be aware of that competition.
Argentina and Brazil in particular, we conveyed to the president that it's not a monopoly. There are other options, and we need to make certain that the president, the administration, understands that. One of the things that I think the president thought he could accomplish was to provide a program for farmers when they lose on trade, to give them a payment. And again, Senator Roberts mentioned this, but we went to the president to tell him our farmers and ranchers don't want another government program. They want to earn their living in the markets. We need the markets. And the president seemed sincerely shocked, surprised at that response. In fact, he said, I've never had a group of members of Congress come tell me they don't want money for their constituents. Everybody takes what I offer. And our point to him was trade is the key to our survival across our state, across our states. And there is no more important issue in my mind for our success in Kansas than our ability to export, and it's not just agriculture. I was in Wichita cutting a ribbon on the 10,000 737 fuselage to come across Spirit Aerosystems work line, 100% aluminum. It is how we earn a living in Kansas, and we've conveyed that to the president. Our hope, in fact, our goal was, Mr. President, you can isolate China by participating in TPP. You can isolate China by getting a NAFTA agreement concluded. You can isolate China by getting us out of a tariff battle with them and zero in on the theft of intellectual property, on the theft of our trade secrets, on their cyber attacks upon us. But you put us back into TPP, and we disadvantage China, and we advantage our own producers, including livestock producers in Kansas. The point is, we're trying to get the president's attention that, yes, China is a problem. They cheat. They misbehave. They don't follow the rules. But it's not the solution is not a broad tariff battle. It's a narrow attack on them, and line up the rest of the world with us against China. Don't isolate us, and keep our markets. I hope what the Secretary and Senator Roberts said is true about NAFTA. The president clearly thinks that Mexico is cooperating, clearly thinks that Canada is not, and I see that. I don't know how this story ends, and I've had Kansans tell me that the president knows what he's doing when it comes to these trade agreements. He's a business person, will be the story that people tell me. I hope this is a negotiating tactic that works, but the risks are tremendous if we don't get it right. If you put the weather and the commodity prices together today and add loss of exports, it's a whole different world for the future of Kansas.
While the Farm Bill serves as a safety net for producers, Moran says we can't overlook the role that community banks are playing in helping farmers and ranchers, especially when times are tough.
The Farm Bill provides a safety net. In tough times, the Farm Bill is there to provide a benefit so that farmers can stay in business. But there's another safety net that gets overlooked, and that's what our lenders do in small towns across Kansas. When times are tough, bankers continue to lend based upon the relationship, a family bank to a family farm, and keeps them in business, access to credit. So when we have commodity prices today, we have difficult times in production, we still have an access to credit because we have community relationship bankers in business. And the last thing that a farmer can tolerate today is for them to lose the relationship they have with people like you at your bank, because you are there on their behalf, because you know their character And if we get regulated in a way that banking, lending becomes a computer program, you plug in the numbers and it spits out a yes or a no answer, that means that that safety net will disappear and our ability to keep family agriculture alive and well is gone. I saw this in Clark County in the fires. 80% of the acres burned in Clark County. The two banks in Ashland, there's no collateral. The cattle are dead. What does a cattleman do, a rancher do in his relationship with his bank when he has no collateral to pledge? Well, in this case, the bankers said, we're going to take care of it. We know you. Our families have cared for your families for generations, and regardless kind of what happens in the regulatory world, we're lending money to our cattlemen. That's what we got to make sure we preserve in Washington, D.C., and that the regulations don't do away with your ability to be a small-town relationship banker across the state of Kansas. You matter to us, and the future of agriculture is going to be determined by whether or not they can access credit in good times when they occur, but especially in bad times that we have way too often.
In regard to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue thinks that the TPP will eventually be addressed and the outcome will be positive for the U.S.
I think it's a matter of time over the TPP that there. You got NAFTA on the table, you got China on the table, you've got these other 232, steel, aluminum on there, you've got other tariffs. I'm optimistic. I think when we get some early wins, we need some wins on NAFTA, we need some wins on China, and I think the president could be persuaded at that point to look at that. He said oftentimes that he doesn't like multilaterals, and even this trilateral between Mexico and Canada bothers him from a negotiating standpoint. But I think we can persuade that that would be the most effective trading tool against China that we could utilize in that regard going forward. But we probably need to get some wins on the board before taking that up.
That's U.S. Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue. He, along with Senators Pat Roberts and Jerry Moran, took part in an agricultural discussion panel yesterday near Manhattan. You're listening to the K-State Radio Network.
Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions.
Listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, produced by Extension Radio at Kansas State University. Growing cover crops to enhance soil quality and nutrient cycling and suppress weeds and pests as part of a wheat production system is growing in popularity with producers. However, water requirements are a concern for growers in western Kansas. With that in mind, K-State researchers are currently conducting field tests and evaluating cover crop management options in water-limited environments. The researchers discussed cover crop management options in dryland wheat-based systems during a cover crop field day last week at the K-State HB Ranch near Hayes. K-State beef specialist at the Northwest Research and Extension Center in Colby, Sandy Johnson, provided producers with options for grazing cover crops.
In western Kansas, rain is always a blessing, and sometimes we don't get that blessing. And so whenever I see something green that looks big enough to graze, I'm interested in grazing it. And as we examine the role of cover crops in western Kansas, some of our work has indicated that if we can't hay or graze that, we may not get enough economic incentive for that initially to justify the practice. So if we can figure out how to use some of that forage for our livestock, can enhance the economic bottom line of the overall operation. So we've been working with some cooperating producers on what type of performance and forage yields we could get in a spring situation. So planting that in late March to early April. Generally, it takes about 50 to 60 days of growth, and we've been getting about 30 days of grazing in this spring cover crop situation. Primarily, cereal grains have made up the largest component of that. Kind of depends on the timing of the planting, what that mixture, what's the predominant in that mix. But from a livestock standpoint, it's all pretty fairly high quality, and we can generate pretty good gains on that. And if we look at growing type of cattle, we've got a range of average daily gains from a little over a pound a day up to over 3 pounds a day. And of course, we could manage those differently, add some supplemental feed to growing cattle if we wanted to maybe increase those over what we thought our potential was on the existing forage. But good quality feed, we can get good gains on livestock. Certainly from a cow-calf perspective, like the ability to put cows on some lush forage prior to breeding. So this spring system allows us to do that for many breeding seasons. Now we've got a range of choices there, but 20, 30 days on a lush forage prior to breeding can really have some beneficial effects for this cow that's lactating, peak of lactation, trying to resume cycles. And we can put a half to a full body condition score on those cows in that time period. So that's another way I like to see that resource used. And we're looking at some impacts on reproduction, have not noted any negative impacts to this point, as long as we're providing sufficient energy and have a slow enough rate of passage that they truly have enough energy to meet their needs. So part of the challenge, though, with using this type of forage is knowing how much you might grow. And we're not going to get the same amount every year. We can, look at some of the range of values that we've generated in our on-farm trials. And, some years in terms of dry matter, that's been over 4,000 pounds. Really great forage, great conditions. And in those years, we found we really didn't have enough cattle to fully utilize that forage adequately. But of course, we're going to probably plan conservatively, and we do want to make sure we leave ample residue. So the hedge is always going to be on that conservative side in terms of how heavily we stock it and how soon we pull those off to maintain as much residue as meets our goals there. So, on the low side, I think we can go down to 0 in that range, but somewhere in the 2,000 pounds range might be kind of a nice planning number. You certainly hope to have much more than that, but I think one has to look at the range of things you might expect to try and determine the economics for your operation. And one of the things that is hard to calculate the value for, if we can utilize in this year where our grass is way behind, and many people have turned out and probably wish they hadn't at this point, if we could stay off of that native pasture for another 30 days, that might be tremendously valuable to not only the health of the pasture long term, but the performance of those cattle as well. So I think there's a lot of places where we can utilize this. It takes a little more planning to be able to deal with the range of conditions that might occur. It forces you to be more flexible than you might want to be. But I think if one's willing to accept, what can be some higher risk or forced into higher flexibility, we think of things our parents wanted us to do as we're growing up, to try something new. You're going to be uncomfortable, but in the end, it might be of great benefit. And I think that's one of those things. And so it takes some management, and there's certainly some learning that you will have going along doing it, but I think it can fit here in western Kansas, and would encourage people to work with those that had some experience to explore how to work for their operation. As we talk about, everybody's interested, well, what should I plant, in a variety of mixes, and how many things need to go in the mix. And I'm not an agronomist, and I have not studied all the literature on various mixes and what they might bring. But what I see from a forage production standpoint is generally there are a couple species that dominate. When we add a few pounds of this and a few pounds of that, we might see 1 or 2 plants here and there from a forage production standpoint, it doesn't do much, so I kind of don't see the value in it. But there may be other values, such as pollinator species or other diversity things that I can't speak to. But I do see that we tend to dominate one or two species. But when we put in a mix, as we have to deal with that, when we can actually get it in, and we got to have the seed on hand, and we might not get it in just when we think we do, that mix may also give us the opportunity to actually find one of those species that really is, the day we got it in, it works for that species in terms of the moisture, the depth, and all those things that might make something go. So there is some advantages to that. We do have a little data here and there on some of those differences in mixtures and what actually germinates and takes over the majority of the stand. But there's lots of opinions on that. You've had my opinion, and I'm interested in forage production to graze, so take that for its perspective. One of the questions people might have is, okay, we've got enough forage here, we want to graze it. How should we go about doing it? When should we start? In a spring situation, we're probably trying to start to graze that when it's 6 to 8 inches tall. If we're lucky, we'll have some regrowth with that. And anytime we have this high quality forage, we like to utilize it as best we can. So if we can strip graze it, we probably can control our situation a little bit better, use some, move on, and in the right conditions, you may be able to come around again and graze that some more. As forage gets taller, for example, if you're grazing something more of a summer-grown cover crop, you're looking at some different situations where you might have some nitrate issues, so you want to have something in the stand family over 18 inches tall before you grazed it to be wary of nitrates and prussic acid. So, timing would be a consideration when you would start to graze, but, often in that summer planted, trying to allow that grow a little further and graze it even after it's froze down is what we're looking at, and that certainly gets some more residue in that fall situation. So in either case, strip grazing probably has some value in terms of controlling our use and how much residue we leave. That's not necessarily everybody likes to put in that little bit of additional fence, and they see that as additional work, but I think there's a payoff for it. But, each producer has to balance the number of things they have on their table and what they can do. But coming from this forage deficit area in general, I like to waste as little as possible and get as much in the cow as I can, and with still leaving enough residue. So generally, strip grazing is going to help you do that. And particularly if you're trying to learn how to, how much you want to graze. If you just start with a small piece and say you didn't move them soon enough, you haven't done that to the entire piece either. So there's some advantage to that in learning and making sure your lessons aren't too expensive.
That's K-State beef specialist at the Northwest Research and Extension Center in Colby, Sandy Johnson, one of the presenters at last week's Cover Crop Field Day at the K-State HB Ranch. As part of that field day, producers were also given a cover crop plot tour and updates on cover crop research, including cover crops and soil health, and cover crops and beneficial insects. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Hello, this is Bill Curtis on behalf of the National Weather Service. Being a native Kansan, I know that springtime can bring life-threatening weather in the form of tornadoes. If the National Weather Service issues a tornado warning for your area, take cover in a basement or small interior room. Stay away from windows and exterior walls, and listen to NOAA Weather Radio to stay abreast of the changing weather situation. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
Listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. I'm Jeff Wichman. In today's agricultural news, Winter wheat is lagging behind condition rating and heading pace from a year earlier. Stephanie Ho reports.
This year's winter wheat is not as highly rated as last year's.
Crop condition is 38% good to excellent. That compares with 50% last year and 44% on average. So we're still seeing some winter wheat areas struggling.
USDA meteorologist Mark Brusberg says some winter wheat growing areas have a problem with dryness.
Texas and Oklahoma stand out. Both states, more than 50% of the crop is in very poor to poor conditions. So those areas saw a little bit of rain this week, but it came, unfortunately, too late in the season to really make a big dent in crop condition in the southern high plains.
Meanwhile,
winter wheat is 73% headed nationally. Last year we were headed 79% and 75% on average.
In Kansas, winter wheat is headed at 89%. That's behind 97% last year and the 91% average. Coloring was 15%, well behind last year's 37%, as well as behind the 22% average. As for corn, Ho says that corn planting is proceeding at a pace that's slightly above average.
Corn planting is nearly complete around the country.
Nationally, corn was 92% planted as of May 27, and that's slightly ahead of both last year and the 5-year average, which is both 90%.
That was USDA meteorologist Mark Brusberg.
Corn has emerged on 72% of the acreage, and that's compared with 70% last year and 69% on average.
Meanwhile, he has the year's first look at corn condition.
79% of the corn crop was rated good to excellent, and that's 14 points above last year's 65%. So corn is progressing well and is generally in good condition nationally.
3% of the nation's corn crop is rated very poor to poor, compared with 7% a year ago.
In Kansas, corn planted was 93%. That's well ahead of last year and the 5-year average. Nationally, Ho says that soybean planting is well ahead of schedule.
Soybean planting is progressing well around the country.
77% of the crop planted this week. That's compared with 65% last year and 62% on average. So it's ahead of both last year and the 5-year average.
That was USDA meteorologist Mark Brusberg.
And the crop is 47% emerged. And again, that's well ahead of last year's 34% and the 32% 5-year average.
He notes progress in some Midwestern states.
Iowa, 81% planted on a 5-year average basis. They're really 71% this time of year. Last week they were 58%. So we're seeing some of the areas with localized dryness advancing rapidly. Indiana had a pretty dry week for the most part. They jumped 14 points this week to 87%. Typically they're at 60% on a 5-year average basis.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
In Kansas, soybean planting was 65%. That's well ahead of last year's 39% and the 37% 5-year average. Emerged was 42%. Again, that's well ahead of last year's 22% and the 28% 5-year average. And in this week's soybean update, Greg Coggy and K-State agricultural economist Terry Griffin discuss precision agriculture connectivity.
Dr. Terry Griffin, cropping systems economist at Kansas State University. And Dr. Griffin, living in rural areas means continued struggles concerning connectivity, broadband availability, and big data, especially for those involved in agriculture. What do you see as some of the underlying issues?
There's several underlying issues when it comes to wireless broadband connectivity in rural areas. One of the leading ones is just a lack of hard wires going out to the rural areas, whether it's for hospitals, public schools, and different communities. Will need fiber or wires going to those areas. And once that's established, that doesn't mean that we're going to have wireless connectivity in those areas, and especially farms, because that will require wireless providers. So that's been one of the limiting factors we've seen in rural areas, is that we can't just put a wireless tower in the middle of nowhere without a wire, because that's equivalent to buying an ice machine without hooking it up to water.
If you have some in that area, is there still a significant gap between upload speeds and download speeds that we see in rural areas?
There is, and not just rural areas, but also in urban areas as well, because internet service providers calibrate the upload and download speeds in favor of download, because most people in residential areas do more download than upload. For instance, think about what you do at home. You're streaming video and looking at content on the internet. In agriculture, especially in the field, we are collecting data from sensors, from lots of different farm equipment, and pushing it up. And so we download very, very little, and the files that we do download in the field are relatively small, but we're trying to push some relatively large files up to the cloud. And so in agriculture, if we had to choose between upload and download speeds, I would choose faster upload speeds than download.
And is the technology getting better to where we can solve some of these things in the future?
Yes and no. You've been hearing about 5G replacing 4G. It's much faster. Although it's faster, it has a shorter distance that it's viable. So if you think about the wireless routers that you have in your home, many of the newer ones will have a 5G option. And so my router is in my basement. It works pretty good. And so it sends out a 5G and a regular connection. My 5G does not work always upstairs or in the backyard, but my regular connection does. The regular connection is much slower, but it has a longer distance. The technology is getting better and faster, but the range from the towers may be getting smaller.
That is Dr. Terry Griffin, cropping systems economist at Kansas State University, who joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update.
And finally, in agricultural news, according to Reuters, getting China to lift its ban on imports of U.S. poultry will be one of the focal points for USDA Undersecretary for Trade and Foreign Agricultural Affairs, Ted McKinney, when he leads a trade team to China this week. China imposed a ban on imports of U.S. poultry in the wake of the U.S. bird flu outbreak, but the U.S. maintains that ban is no longer justified, as there have been no new cases of bird flu in the U.S. for more than a year. China removed some restrictions on imports of U.S. poultry earlier this year, but has maintained the ban linked to the U.S. bird flu outbreak. And that's a look at today's agricultural news. This reminder to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, or using an app on your mobile device, type these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. By tapping the subscribe button, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. That's agtoday.net. This is the K-State Radio Network.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. This week's Lawn and Garden segment focuses on a few of the questions K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Johnson County, Dennis Patton, has been fielding over the past few weeks: herbicide injury and winter overkill. Dennis, one thing about Kansas, there's always some odd weather, and we're maybe starting to see some effects in the home landscape caused by some odd weather.
You know, every year working in the gardening world, horticulture world in Kansas is always interesting. But for some reason, I think 2018 may take the cake. It may be the most bizarre because we've had, warm, cold, warm, hot instead of warm. And so it's just really kept horticulturists, gardeners, whether you're the farmer or whether you're the backyard gardener, it's kept us on our toes this year.
One of the questions you're getting deals with herbicide and winter injury.
Yeah, one is winter kill. We've seen so much winter kill over the winter months on a lot of our plants, that some that are kind of marginal in our climate and some that are fairly durable. And I think it has to do with, we did hit -2 there a few days, in some parts of the state were colder, some were warmer. And you combine that with the extremely dry late summer, fall, winter we have, many plants died to the ground. The good news is a lot of them came back from their root system, and unfortunately some of our evergreens, some of them just croaked over the winter months.
Is there something that we can be doing to try and help them along?
You know, when it comes to the winter kill, pretty much the plant by this time of the year, here we are almost June 1st, you know, it's going to tell you whether it's alive or dead. Many of the plants that have come back, like crepe myrtle, butterfly bush, a few others, all the growth is coming right from the base. So, you know, now's a good time to get out there and just clean the plant up and take out all that dead wood and allow that new growth to flourish. If you're going to water during the summer, you may want to put a little bit of fertilizer on it too, just to encourage a little bit more growth. But outside of that, if you're seeing no signs of life out of those plants at this point, especially with the warm May we had, then more than likely that plant is, well, let's just say toast.
At that point, then, do we need to think about replacements, and do we need to just get them out of that space?
You know, dead is dead. It's probably not going to really cause any problems leaving it there. I think the question would be, yes, we could certainly go ahead and replace. But, you know, with as wacky as weather we've had this spring, you know, winter, are we betting that summer is going to be hot and dry? That's going to make it more difficult to establish. Is summer going to be more normal, or are we going to have abundant rainfall? You know, if you're an optimist, you'd plant and roll with the punches. If you're a pessimist and think, oh my gosh, this is just the start of a long June, July, August, September of hot, dry, then you may want to wait so you have one less plant to worry about taking care of in a hot, dry summer. The other main problem we're seeing on our gardening hotline this year is about every day we're getting 3 or 4 questions or photos on plants in the garden, vegetables, flowers, trees, shrubs, damaged by herbicides. With everyone out there this spring on those warmer, windy days back in March, spraying the broadleaf herbicides to control dandelions and things, now we're paying the price as people out there trying to control those weeds. The good news is most of those plants that were just damaged by a drift will be fine. They'll recover, but they will be a little bit delayed. But, you know, those weeds, the dandelions henbit, are best controlled in the fall months when they're small little rosettes just starting to grow and plants are going dormant. But now let's fast forward here to end of May. For some reason, what rain did move through, it seems like every weed seed, because of that warmer period we had early on, has really just gone into overdrive. Crabgrass started germinating early, a lot of other weeds. So we are seeing a lot of comments come in with ID that weed. So I think it's going to be a bad weed summer for us. There are a couple options for you. The best control is something that's been around since the dawn of time, and that is the good old-fashioned hoe. You know, people don't like using it because it's hot and sweaty and gets calluses on your hands, but it's pretty darn effective. You know, spot spraying some herbicides very carefully, especially kind of some of the more glyphosate products that don't tend to drift. It's our broadleaf herbicides that tend to drift and affect our other broadleaf plants. So a little, you know, properly timed, carefully applied herbicide injury can help. But, you know, the other best thing to take care of weeds is that good old layer of mulch. You know, 3-4 inches of mulch, whether it be in the flower garden, the shrub garden, or the vegetable garden, tends to be our most effective weed control. And best of all, it's organic, and it also has other side benefits as controlling moisture, keeping the soil cooler during a hot summer for better plant growth, and in the vegetable garden, better production, more rewards, more harvest to take in and enjoy.
You mentioned trees, and that can be a problem when we think that they're getting moisture over the winter and they really don't get as much as they needed. We may start seeing some issues there as well.
That's correct. You know, I think some parts of the state are still in some drought conditions. Evergreens are the ones I'm most concerned with. And I've even noticed here around Johnson County, and I was back home over the weekend in south central Kansas, and there's a lot of trees that are just really struggling. And I think that has to do with our last 4 or 5 years. Throughout most of the state of Kansas, we've just had one extreme or the other. We've had, you know, prolonged periods of wetness followed by drought periods. And it's just that kind of feast or famine weather that really has plants struggling and being in a weakened condition. So, yeah, if there's something, especially younger trees, evergreens, and by younger, I'm going to say 5-10 years less, you know, if you're not getting those deep soaking rains, then now would be a good time to turn that hose on a slow trickle and really just make sure they go into what's always our hottest, driest part of summer with good soil moisture, because that'll go a long way in keeping them healthy and alive for the long term.
We were talking about flowers not too long ago, and I noticed that our peonies this year seemed to bloom late, and when they did, there just wasn't much life to them. They didn't last long.
Yeah, peonies are one of Kansas's most favorite plants. About every farmstead house has them. And, they were delayed because of the cool April. But then when they started to flower, we hit the 90s in May, and in a day or two, they just went from beautiful to brown. They are used to flowering more in, mid-upper 70s, low 80 weather, and you put that 10, 15 degree warmer weather on them, in a day or two, they were shot, which is really disappointing because that is, like I said, one of our favorite springtime flowers, and they just kind of came and went overnight. The plants are going to be fine. Hopefully next year the blooms will be fine, but unfortunately we just didn't see much of a show this year. Same thing happened to our iris, too. They just came and went almost overnight.
That's K-State Research and Extension Horticulture Agent for Johnson County, Dennis Patton. To find answers to your lawn and garden questions, contact your county or district extension office. And to listen to Agriculture Today anytime, visit agtoday.net, where you can listen on demand and find links to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Stitcher Radio. This is the K-State Radio Network.